The Rhine is often reduced to a geographic feature on a map, but throughout European history it functioned as something more consequential, a structural barrier that repeatedly decided whether power could be contained and when it could no longer be stopped. Across centuries, from Roman legions to Napoleonic armies, the mechanized forces of the Second World War, the Rhine consistently marked the transition between stability and collapse. When armies approached it, it wars entered a decisive phase. When armies crossed it, the outcome of those wars ceased to be uncertain. Geographically, the Rhine's importance lies not merely in its length or volumes, but in the orientation and physical character. Flowing from south to north, broad, fast-moving, and difficult to bridge under pressure, it directly cuts across Europe's main east-west axis of conflict. Historically, the more consequential Europe's struggles occurred between powers based in the west, particularly France, and the fragmented or later unified Germany lands to the east. The Rhine lay squarely in the path of the tension. It was not a peripheral obstacle, but a central one, a natural line that forces armies to concentrate, slow down, and expose themselves at precisely the moment when momentum mattered most. The Roman Empire was the first to formalize this reality. For Rome, the Rhine was not just a river, but a frontier between order and uncertainty. West of it lay Roman administration, laws, roads, taxation, and permanent military infrastructure. East of it lay tribal confederation, dense forests, and logistical risks. Rome crossed the Rhine repeatedly in punitive expeditions, but the cost of permanent conquest proved too high. Eventually, the empire accepted the river as a practical limit to expansion. This decision wasn't not ideological, it was strategic. The Rhine imposed a cost-benefit calculation that even the most powerful empire of antiquity respected. In doing so, it established a pattern that would repeat for the next two millennia. After Rome's decline, the Rhine retained its role as a civilizational divider. During the medieval period, it separated the evolving French monarchy from the complex and fragmented political landscape of the Holy Roman Empire. Neither side fully controlled the river in a unified sense, but both understood its significance. It functioned as a buffer zone, sometimes peaceful, often tense, and always central to strategic planning. The Rhine was not a clear border, it was a line beyond which ambitions became more expensive and more dangerous. This latent significance became explicit during the French Revolution and the Napoleonic era. Before Napoleon, France's eastern border lay largely west of the Rhine, and the river represented the outer edge of French security. Revolutionary rhetoric spoke of natural borders, and the Rhine was frequently invoked as one of them. Yet Napoleon fundamentally altered this logic. When French armies crossed the Rhine in the late 1790s, they did more than invade enemy territory, they overturned centuries of strategic restraint. Crossing the Rhine from west to east meant entering the German lands, dismantling the political order of Central Europe and projecting French power beyond its traditional limits. When historians say Napoleon crossed the Rhine, they compress an entire strategic transformation into a single phase. French forces did not merely cross at a symbolic point, they crossed repeatedly, rapidly, and in strength. Pontoon bridges, coordinated maneuvers, and speed neutralized the river's defensive advantage. Once crossed, French armies didn't retreat back behind the Rhine. They reorganized the region, dissolved the Holy Roman Empire, and imposed a new political structure under French dominance. The Rhine ceased to be French boundary and became its rear area. It transformed from a shield into a launchpad. This shift had profound consequences for Europe by turning into Rhine an operational base rather than a limit. Napoleon destabilized the existing balance of power. German states were forced into dependency. Austria pushed back, and Prussia was humiliated. The river that had once constrained French ambition now protected French expansion. Even after Napoleon's eventual defeat, the memory of this transformation lingered. Europe had seen what happened when the Rhine was crossed decisively, and it could not return to its previous assumptions. The 19th century attempted to destabilize this tension, but the underlying strategic reality remained unresolved. The unification of Germany in 1871 reversed the pressure once again. A powerful industrialized German state now faced France across the same river. The Rhine regained its role as a line of anxiety, but the direction of fear changed. French strategists worried about German crossing westward, while German planners viewed the Rhine as the backbone of their western defense. The river's meaning didn't change, only the identity of those who depended on it did. By this By the Second World War, the Rhine had returned to its oldest and most brutal function, the last barrier before the collapse of a great power. After Germany's early victories gave way to strategic overreach and eventual defeat, the Rhine became the final credible defensive line in the West. Everything before it, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, had already been lost. Everything behind it was Germany's industrial heartland and political core. When Allied commanders spoke of reaching the Rhine, they were not engaging in metaphor. They were identifying the final structural obstacle between the Allies and victory in Western Europe. In 1944 and 1945, the Rhine was defended with desperation. Bridges were wired for demolition, river banks were fortified, remaining German forces were ordered to hold at all costs. The logic was ancient and unforgiving. As long as the Rhine held, Germany could delay, negotiate, or hope for political fractures among the Allies. Once it fell, time itself would become the enemy. The Rhine was no longer about territory, it was about inevitability. When Allied forces finally crossed the Rhine, the meaning was immediately clear. Whether the crossing occurred at Remagen with the unexpected capture of a bridge, or through massive planned operations involving pontoon bridges, airborne landing, tanks, and of overwhelming firepower, the implications was the same. The western The last western wall had been breached. German forces could no longer reorganize around the geography. The paths into Germany's interior lay open. Berlin became a question of timing rather than possibility. The phrase, the phrase "crossing the Rhine" endures because it captures something that goes beyond military engineering. Armies cross many rivers in war, but only a few crossings fundamentally alter the structure of a conflict. The Rhine belonged to this rare category. It represents the moment where containment fails and domination becomes possible. This is why the phrase appears again and again in historical accounts separated by centuries, always carrying the same weight. The destruction of Rhine bridges at the end of wars offers a powerful visual summary of this role. Twisted steel collapsing into calm water symbolizes more than physical ruin. It represents the collapse of a strategic system that relied on the river as protection. The Rhine itself remains unchanged, flowing steadily beneath clouds that once reflected artillery fire and now reflect silence. Empires, ideologies, and armies vanish, but the river continues, and indifferent to the ambitions imposed upon it. Ultimately, the Rhine reaches a harsh and recurring lesson about power. Geography doesn't determine outcomes by itself, but it determines the cost of ambition, the speed of collapse. When an army is forced to defend the Rhine, it is already under severe pressure. When an army crosses it in strength, it has already achieved strategic superiority. The river marks the transition point where restraint gives way to momentum, and uncertainty gives way to inevitability. Today, the Rhine flows peacefully through prosperous cities and open borders, its banks lined with commerce rather than fortification. Yet its historical role has not vanished. It remains a reminder that some places matter not because of what they contain, but because of what they prevent, and because of what happens when prevention fails. In European history, the Rhine is where wars stop because wars stop being contests and start becoming conclusions.